Maybe you have a better
That was two white people being incredibly white.
I guess you would know that's for your school.
Welcome to the Fine Arts Building here at Binghamton University in Binghamton, New York. We're facing the conclusion of the Northeast University's debating championship, and we have 4 fine teams who have come to represent the Northeast in this debate. First of all, on the government side, the first government team will be from the University of Vermont, Sam Natale and Sam Rickard. Second government team is from the Rock, the University of Rochester, Ben Fultz and Rob Bartlett. The opposition teams represent the Juggernaut from Hobart and HWSmith College. Both teams, the first opposition team, Kate Bardsley and Adam Goldstein.
Yeah.
Woo! Okay. All right. And the some kind of opposition team, yes, John Monahan and Tiffany Bennett.
Yeah.
You are so amazing.
We have a highly extinguished judging panel in today's contest. Chairing the panel will be the newly announced Debate Director of the Year for the Northeast from St. John's, Steve Yano. Trying to copy Steve's fashion statement from Cornell University, Sam Nelson. Also, visiting coach from Japan, now located in New York, Jonathan Bora. The motion before the House today is, this House believes that it's time to retire the nation-state system. Have a great debate, and we'll be back at the end with the results.
All right, we call to the podium the Prime Minister to speak for 7 minutes.
Before I start, I just want to say I'm really sick to be here and hope we have a good debate. So. The curtain has opened on the 21st century, and boy, are we off to a lousy start. We have wars, we have poverty. You know what? It looks like we're just the big budget sequel to the 20th century. But on the government side, we say that this doesn't have to be the case, and we say it won't be the case if you propose and retire the nation-state system. So I'm going to get into what that means. The nation-state system is defined as the system in which states are formed as predominantly homogeneous unitarian governments, usually defined by a single ethnicity. And what I mean is France because it's French, Japan is Japan because it is Japanese. And what we would do is, in its place, we would encourage and enlarge supranational organizations and have them act as the primary form of government. And this would usually involve using existing supranational organizations that we have, such as the African Union, the European Union, etc., etc. So if anyone has any questions, I'd like to take a point of information at this time. All right, you are good with everything. So let's go right on to the matter which is why. I'm going to introduce these in a problem-solution format. A problem of the 20th century and how we can solve it in the 21st. The first problem is going to be disunity and war. The second problem is going to be economic disparity. And the third problem, which my partner will address, is the fundamental flaw in the illusion of ethnicity. So let's get right to that problem of disunity and war. In the status quo, and in the 20th century, states waged war mostly on ethnic lines. Let's take the two biggest examples of this were the two world wars, in which French fought Germans, Chinese fought Japanese, and lines were usually drawn along these ethnic borders. However, ethnic groups, under a strong, unified system, tend to do a lot better. I mean, I'm going to say that there are exceptions to this. But the exceptions usually occur when there's a single dominant ethnicity that prevails over smaller ethnicities, which is why the larger supranational organization you have functioning as the government, the better it is. And the model for this is the European Union. After thousands of years of bloody conflict, Europe is now the most peaceful place to be. Yes, sir.
Are you aware that the European Union, although finally has come to some agreement about the form of their constitution, still won't even have a general election on whether or not the people like it?
I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight. We're talking about a big change, so you're naive, sir, to think that it should happen in this, and to complain that it isn't happening fast enough for you. The fact is, they're making the Constitution, and they are going to have this resolution, and so they're making progress, illustrating the point that we're talking about. Supranational, and the basic outcome of all of this would be that supranational organizations would see a decrease in interstate war. A good example of this would be Serbia and Kosovo. That problem right now would, in the 20th century, have erupted into an interstate war. But in the 21st, because of the stability that the European Union provides, is going to be able to be pacified and be able to be handled diplomatically through talks. So, I'd like to go into my second problem of the 20th century, which is the problem of economics. And this has two facets. The economic disparity that we saw and how to fix it, and that this would also produce a benefit of an increase in trade. So let's get right to economic disparity. In the 20th century, there are rich states and poor states, and oftentimes these are even in very close proximity to each other. You have a France, and you have a Hungary. You have a Kenya, and you have an Uganda. And the fact is that states that live so close, that have resources that are so similar, should not have such great economic disparities. And the reason that they do is because each state is acting in completely its own interest. But in a supranational economic system, you have states with larger financial shares having to look out for states with smaller financial shares because they're fundamentally tied into the same system. So you don't see interstate exploitation like you did in the 20th century. And another good example of this is Europe, where the rich states have had a large interest in helping prop up the economies of smaller, poorer states in that. Yes?
But when you no longer have separate economies competing with each other, where do you get the incentive for economic growth?
I don't think that state economies should compete. If you know economics, you know that competition should occur between companies, not between states. And so let's go right on to an increase in trade. And supranational unions tend to have less barriers to trade. And since we talk about economics, this is the principle of capitalism. If we're all making something and we're all trading more, more people win. But in the 20th century, this was very hard to do because a lot of places lacked the interstate infrastructure to have commerce. And a great example of this is Africa, that has a lot of infrastructure for trading within a state to go to the coastline, but very little infrastructure and railways to go between countries. If they had a supranational organization which could set up these railways that would go between countries, we would see African nations developing interdependent economies instead of just being locked into the cycle of neocolonialism. We've also seen this in the case of the United States, where the passage of NAFTA allowed for greater trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and a disruption of the American sugar monopolies, and an increase in the quality of life for Mexican sugar farmers. And this is a good thing, because I believe that we can all agree that equality is a good thing, that economic prosperity is a good thing, and that peace is a good thing. So let's not be this big budget sequel to the 20th century, where we're still caught up in our petty ethnic conflicts, when we're still held back by our lack of infrastructure. The government solves for this. Now, they're going to come up and give you a case of fear of what might happen, but let's think about it this way. Not what could happen negatively, but the glory that could happen for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call the podium the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for the opposition.
I'd like to thank everybody for what I hope will become a
good debate, and I'd like to start off by saying that while what the government is proposing may sound initially like a good idea, I'd like to remind people that this is essentially a wolf in sheep's clothing. We've done this all before, and we've done it all before in the beginning of the 20th century. We've changed some terms, we've finagled around some definitions, but it's been done before, and I'd like to revisit what, as you said, with the things that happened in the World Wars, particularly World War I. And I'd like to revisit some of the things that Woodrow Wilson had said after World War I on why it was caused and why he promoted the nation state. World War I was caused by imperial power and the alliance system. You had a group of a few imperial states, you know, you had the British on one hand, you had Germans on another, you had Austria-Hungary on another, and so you see you had this clash between imperial powers. And so there's a slight difference. Today we're calling them supranational governments, and instead of one state being the total dominant, we now have a collective of states working together. But in a sense, it's the same thing, this combination of imperial power and the alliance system. And so we'd like to say that the World War happened because small little conflict, you know, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and then the kicks in the alliance system, and then you find the whole world at war between these imperial powers. And so after it was over, Woodrow Wilson, former president of the United States, supported an end to this colonialism, to this imperialism, in favor of nationalism, the nation state, the people's right to define themselves and govern themselves through political and economic means. So, you know, in coming up with this idea for the nation state, he had good intentions, and we'd like to say that it hasn't quite finished yet, and that we have the same situation happening all over again today. So we'd like to compare. We'd like to compare that now there's neo-imperialism. We have this situation similar to prior to World War I, that imperialist states still exist. For instance, you know, in the past, you had European nations carving up Africa and India, the Middle East, for resources, and then going back on and selling their goods there. Presently, you have multi-ethnic states like the United States invading Iraq, instituting Western democracy in an attempt to gain an ally and have more control of oil exports. You have exports. You have something like the European Union. Now, instead of just one state, you have a collection of powerful states that can now wage their influence over others. And so we'd have to say that we still need the nation state to prevent the abuse of developed countries going after to the other developing countries. And so with this new neo-imperialism, yes, we've changed the term slightly, but we're seeing a repeat of something that had happened all before.
Yes, so you're trying to compare the UN to what we proposed, but the UN doesn't have its own monetary source of money, and it still has the idea of the nation state within it. So how can you compare that to what we're
Well, the
doing?
UN doesn't have sovereignty. I was comparing things like the EU, and I don't think I said the UN in there. So comparing things like the EU, which is a collective, like they said, a supranational government, or you have something like the United States, which is, you know, multi-ethnic, and it's not a true nation state. And so I'd like to move on to the next point, that even though this neo-imperialism is just a repeat, we'd also like to say responsible government. States that are relatively ethnically homogenous are more responsible to the needs of their own people. And we'd like to say that you know, imperial powers or supranational governments are not likely to focus on the needs of the people. They're likely to focus on the needs of the elite. You know, the people who are keeping things in power. And we're going to do the same thing, a historical comparison to the present. You know, for instance, you had something like Imperial China, multi-ethnic state, who considered only the needs of the people in power, the imperial powers, not really the common people or all of the multi-ethnic groups. And you know, presently today, we're going to say that organizations like the EU are not responsive to the needs of all of its people. That's going to be responsive to the collective identity of Europe. And so, you know, you have the smaller groups being completely ignored in the overall framework of the European Union. And so I'd like to refute a few of their points. And they're saying that states wage war mostly on ethnic lines, and we're going to say that that's not entirely true. You know, there was definitely the alliance system in World War I, as I had already demonstrated. Germans weren't fighting against the French because they hated them for ethnic reasons. They were fighting because of this alliance and imperialism system.
And yet wasn't it intensified by these ethnic tensions that allowed the Germans to say the French weren't humans because they weren't German?
I think maybe you get a sense of that in World War too. So I think it's a little disanalogous. However, I don't think that this sort of like ethnic cleansing is analogous to this system, because they weren't nation states, they were definitely imperialist and alliance-based systems. And they also said that there's a decrease in interstate war. And I'm going to say that that's probably not true, because you see that they jumped the gun not once but twice in a short period of time. And so having these supranational governments or having multi-ethnic states is only going to increase wars between people. And then they say that there's economic disparity, and we're going to agree with that. There are rich states and poor states, but this isn't going to cure it. It's going to make it worse, because now the EU is in a greater position to take advantage of states that have really poor economic standing. Disagree?
Yes, can you have any substantiation for this? Because hasn't the quality of life in all European countries increased under the EU?
In the EU, yes, but what about their trading partners? What protects them from anything? You now have this super huge government, this huge trading bloc that they have to deal with, and it could go to make things considerably worse. I think people already made the argument once before that, oh, under imperialism, white man's burden were helping them out, but they only made it worse. Sure, it was great for the colonizer and for the imperialist, but it wasn't so much for the people who were colonized. So we're going to say that it's really not going to help out this disparity between rich states and poor states. It's only going to make it worse. And so we'd have to say that for all these reasons, particularly because we've been through this before, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I call to the podium the Deputy Prime Minister to speak for 7 minutes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's truly my pleasure to continue this debate for the government side. In terms of structure, I'm going to start off with a bit of refutation that was just proposed by the opposition. I'm going to reiterate the arguments that my partner just made, and then I'm going to bring my new matter into this debate. Now, among the things said by the first member of the opposition is that homogenous groups take care of states of largely homogenous ethnicities tend to take care of each other better. But what we're saying is that we need to break down the system so that we can look at this as in the bigger picture, so that the interests are not just of one group, but of this entire super governmental organization as a whole, and that we recognize that this group is doing better and this group is doing worse, and we want to end this disparity. We want to close this gap by bringing everyone together and not thinking us in terms of these groups, which will later go on to my new matter. He was talking about no, sir. He was talking about the cause of war, and what's the cause of war? Is it these empirical alliances, or is it this collaboration between nations? And we're arguing that it's the collaboration between nations that drags people into war, and that a system of an overarching supergovernmental organization is going to prevent these. As my partner said, he said that states mostly go. No, he said that states mostly go to war with other ethnically different states, and this is the case. The case is states wage war based on state to state, and yes, ma'am.
Haven't we seen civil wars and internal revolutions in the past? Like, how does your world government solve for this problem?
Our world government solves for this problem by recognizing that the conflict is not affecting this one state, and therefore we can ignore it because they're their own separate state and they can take care of their own problem. We recognize that the supergovernmental organization realizes that if there's a conflict in one part of it, is a problem for everyone. We're talking about unification, and we're talking about that the priority, that we shouldn't prioritize one over the other. We need to look at everyone as a whole. My partner also talked about the economic benefits that can be derived from these super governmental organizations. We break down the barriers to trade, and the interests of the poorer countries and the interests of the richer countries come closer together. Because what we need to talk about, folks, is really what creates more unity, because unity leads to a decrease in self-interest. In the current nation-state system, people only think about themselves, and therefore the problems that exist outside of their nation states seem less relevant, when in fact we see that these problems can come to hurt them back at home, where we see that the problems of another state can have an impact on this state, even if it is doing well. So I need to talk about my new matter, which is we need to end this concept of race or ethnicity, and that the nation-state system is one of the predominant things that gives credence to this. We need to start on this small level and expand to a different level, because folks, fundamentally, between human beings, there hardly is any difference. Genetically, there's hardly any difference except the way we look. And human beings, in all their tolerance and compassion and all their alleged knowledge, we are so quick to judge on whether or not you looked and act the same of us, therefore we're going to create this division. But fundamentally, within the nation-state system, people think of themselves as one thing or another. You're Irish, you're English, you're Scottish. Well, there's not much difference between the Irish, the English, and the Scottish. There's not much difference between the Swedes, the Danes, and the Finns, between South Africans, Senegalese. All of these people that all these people that identify themselves based on state lines need to take a look at the bigger reality that they are actually of these same groups. And therefore, why should we think of these groups as any different from one another? Once we break down the nation-state system and have these conglomerate super governments, we will be able to examine one another on a much natural level, sir.
But aren't you completely ignoring the pride people feel in being Scottish, for instance, and the fact that Scotland just got its own parliament?
Sir, the pride people feel is derived from where they like where they live, and they think where they live is a good place. I can still feel proud of myself from where I am, but I don't have to attach this label to it, because once you start dividing people up, this is the base. No, sir. Once you start dividing people up, this is the root of dominance and the root of discrimination. We can't give credence to the fact that we can establish people as different, because what we're trying to say is that we're really not, ma'am.
Okay, people who live in like the Northeast in America and like the Southwest have very different beliefs. Like, how do you account for these sort of regional differences that will still exist?
Regional differences are based on other things, such as religious beliefs and other cultural beliefs. But what we're saying is that within these nation-state systems, there will be a sharing of cultural beliefs. We can break down as thinking, okay, you're from this state and you're from this state. We can think, no, we're going to exchange this information and realize that we have more in common than we have in difference, because this is what it's really all about. Should we think ourselves in these little tiny groups, these nation states, and furtherly divide into these ethnic groups? No. We should think of ourselves as human beings. We should think of ourselves entirely equal. And this is what it's all about. What creates more equality? A bunch of states fighting amongst each other, a bunch of states refusing to trade with one another, a bunch of states that think one state is better than another for no real reason. Because as I'm saying, ethnicity is a false concept, and race is a false concept, and the nation-state system provides credence. So just in summation, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to solve the problems that my partner outlined and that we're facing within the 21st century? War, economic disparity, and racial discrimination. If we maintain the nation-state system, these problems are only going to get worse as we think of ourselves as different. But under these larger super governmental organizations, we can look at each other as people who, because the only thing that really separates us is an ocean between us. And once we think of ourselves as separate groups within these not as separate groups, but as these larger regions, we can help to end these problems. And that's why I beg you to propose.
Thank you. I now call to the floor the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to speak for 7 minutes.
Okay, first of all, what was interesting was when my partner and I were talking about this case to begin with, is when we were talking about the history and how it sort of is a parallel to the 20th century, we were like, there's another white man's burden. And I'll get into how that even is more I'll get into that more in depth later, but what the last speaker just talked about is a perfect example of how that was really proven. So first of all, I'd like to get into our points and I'll do our refutation, because the government's plan is not going to be successful. Okay, so my partner talked about a comparison between what happened before and what happened now. That's when I'll talk about how this white man's burden is still going on in a different light. So previously, the white man's burden was about religious emphasis and the idea that we know what's best for other countries. This idea that we should make a supranational government, which the government hasn't defined how that would be created. is another idea of how we know that these countries, first of all, don't have distinctions between one another. Second of all, that they do not have the right to, no thank you, that they do not know how to govern themselves, to know what's in their best interest. So, the idea that there's, the last speaker talked about how individual, Scottish are no different from the English. We can't make that distinction. Besides that, the EU, members of EU, the people who live there, don't even make that distinction. When they talk about where they're from, they don't say, I'm from the EU. They say, I'm from France, I'm from England. They still identify as a specific nationality, which says that the government's idea that this would say, oh, it would show people that there's no difference. That wouldn't be true. And also note the comparison. They didn't say, oh, English are no different from the South Africans. They didn't say across, it was only about nations that are next to one another. And what the whole idea was supposed to be about, I thought, was identifying with different nations. Why stick to the same region according to the government's plan? Like, why do that? What's the advantage to doing that? Different nations don't have all the same goals, and it shouldn't be seen as such. Go ahead.
Yes, aren't the divisions that you're making a product of the status quo, and how humans currently view that there are divisions, and if we were to enact our plan over time, those divisions would cease to be?
So, I'm not quite clear what you are advocating. Do you think that since there should just be no distinctions, that we should just have an overall world government? What does that mean? I mean, how can you focus on individual issues? Not every area of the earth has the same economic problems. They don't have the same resource problems. They don't have the same sorts of structures. The idea that the EU is such a great state, or a great area, because that they have great infrastructure for one another, and that they're stable, because that they have a supranational government doesn't actually stand. Because they were stable before the EU was created. They had infrastructure before the EU was created. So it's not due to the supranational structure. You can't say that that would happen if you put that in Africa. Where would the resources come from? So we're saying that in essence, this is no different from what happened. We can't assume that we know what is best for individual countries, and that they do know what's best for themselves. We need this nation state to prevent that abuse that would happen from thinking that nations are like one another, that they're all the same, that they have no individual problems, that everyone on earth is the same and has the same issues. That's not true. We understand that we have our own individual problems. The idea of globalism hasn't even really taken a full effect. People don't understand what the consequences of individual countries are doing to one another, and you can't just say making a world government would solve that in some way. No, thank you. So I talked about the need to prevent the nation state, the need for the nation state to prevent the abuse by more powerful countries and less powerful countries. Again, I'll bring up the point that the government has not established who would be designing the supranational government. So we don't know how that would even be decided. For one thing, EU decided themselves. Can't other nations, if they would like this system in place, decide that for themselves? We don't need to have this taken on as our responsibility, because we believe that these countries are responsible for themselves, that they can handle those kinds of responsibilities. And that leads to the third point that my partner made. States that are ethnically homogenous are more responsible because they know what their own issues are. There are conflicts between ethnicities, and grouping them together are not going to solve those conflicts. Previously, that caused civil war, and that's why these individual countries were formed. So to deny that they made any action in order to have the separation and now allow themselves to be seen as distinct doesn't make any sense, and just ignores that they have any sort of idea of what is best in for their best interest.
Okay, so you keep making this false comparison to imperialism, but isn't there a difference between an empire, which is one ethnic group dominating another against their will, versus all these ethnic groups coming together willingly like the EU?
There's nothing preventing anyone from creating this the sort of system like the EU has, but it hasn't been done. So I thought, because it wasn't clear on your side, that it would be just enacted and we should just put it into place wherever we wanted to. So until the government actually makes that clear, no thank you. Until the government made that clear, which they already stated their plan, so now it would be them creating their plan along the way, they did not define how this would be created. And that is an error on their part. No thank you. So I'll get into refutation. The idea that there would be disunity, and that that because that laws were drawn along ethnic borders, and that a creation of a supranational system would be more peaceful. I already established that the EU, before it was created, all the nations that are within the EU, before it was created, were already stable. They already had the infrastructure that would be necessary in order to make this trade that we talked about so beneficial. You can't, I mean, since they don't have like an overall fund, they don't have, you can't just say, where's that money going to come from? I mean, how would that even be possible? It's not a direct correlation that because there would be a supranational government, that there would immediately be easier routes to trade within, and that would be somehow beneficial. The decrease in war, already I said that before, regrouping was the cause of civil war and trying to get individual nation states. So this would not be a solution because regrouping them together against their will would not be something that we'd be advocating for. Because the effects that they claimed will not take place, and because we know that the nation state needs to be in place to prevent abuse, we say on opposition side that this needs to be not put into place. Please vote for opposition unless you think that we should have another World War I.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon the member of the government to continue arguments for the government side of the House.
Okay, in the words of the Vulcans said, live long and prosper. So we must ask ourselves, what's the best route in which we can live long and prosper? Okay, if you look at Star Trek, they created the Federation. The Federation was a bunch of different countries coming together for a common goal. And that is what we're trying to create. The opposition over here basically said, well, we can't do this because it doesn't exist today. Well, the reason why we're at this debate is to create it. So how can you use that argument? That's like saying you can't invent something new because it doesn't exist. That doesn't hold any water. Okay, she says that World War I is going to create another World War I. Well, I say World War I is the root cause of all these problems. World War I created fake boundaries, where it created these ethnic conflicts in the Middle East, where you have the Kurds and the other ethnic groups fighting over land. And I just want to go on to my extension. My extension is that the need for cohesion, and cohesion is the best way for peace. Okay, if we look at this debate, we're obviously from two different schools, correct? They're from Vermont and we're from Rochester, but we work together to put a common goal together, and our common goal is to win this debate. And it could work in the governmental framework. No thanks. Okay. And the EU is a great example. They say, well, they were always stable. Well, they're not always stable. 60 years ago, we had this thing that was called World War II, where it caused millions of deaths. And even in the current realm, you have poorer countries such as Moldova, and then you have Britain. They're not equal. We want to bring this equality. And you bring equality and peace through cohesion. Yes.
Can you explain how this would happen in like a country like, in a continent like Africa, where there are much fewer countries where there actually is stability?
Because once you give them infrastructure, once you give them a way to support themselves, you're going to have the better off countries coming together with the weaker ones to support each other. No, thank you. Okay, and this idea of cohesion. Okay, we're not saying that everybody's going to wear a red shirt and blue pants. They're still going to have cultural identity. We're not going to all be robots and walking around, oh, we must do the exact same things. Of course there's still going to be cultural identity. There's just going to be peace. Why is there going to be peace? Because culture in itself creates no need to understand other people, because if you just stay in your little island and you don't come together, then you don't listen to other viewpoints. Yes.
So how do you reflect the fact that people want their culture to be reflected in their government? Such as the British respect
Sure.
the royal family, having a royal family.
The royal family doesn't exist. It's just a figurehead. You have a prime minister, and we're not forcing these people. It's going to be through a democratic process. People are going to sit down, say what they want, and we're going to come to a collective bargain. Okay, no thank you. Okay, and we say that this cohesion creates more knowledge and more prosperity, because if the Japanese now have to come together with the South Africans, they can share their technology. Therefore, we can work together to improve our technological advances in healthcare and whatnot. Okay, I would like to move on. There would be, with a more diverse group, it's more difficult to convince people to go to war. Like if you look at Europe, when they were separate countries, there was war all the time. But if you have to convince every single ethnic group to go to war, why would you fight against yourself? I mean, it'd be like chopping my right arm, chopping off my left arm. It doesn't make much sense to me. If you're all supporting each other, why would you cut off your support base? Yes.
How many wars has the United States fought in the last 40 years? How many wars has Holland? As a homogenous state.
What's your question? The U.S. has fought about 4 in the last 20 years, and I don't know how many Holland has fought. But anyways, I don't see the relevance. Okay. So what do we bring to the table? We bring cohesion and cooperation. We say through the spread of knowledge, through the spread of prosperity, we can make a better world, just as the Federation did. Just as the Federation did in the 24th century. There's no hunger, there's no war, and there's peace in the world. And if I could do the Vulcan sign, I could do it, but I would do it, but I can't. I'm sorry. You.
How does your federation lead from joining people together to like ending world hunger? I mean,
Because
where's the connection to go from A to Z?
Don't you see? Like this little island out in the Pacific doesn't have any resources. But when you put it when we're all one country, with the United States thing spreads out its resources and gives it to everybody. There's no greed. These are flawless. The divides in our world are just flawless because it's just the way we perceive the world today, because that's the way we've been brought up. Okay? If 50 years from now, after our plan has been enacted, those little 5-year-olds are not going to remember the day where we were all divided, where we all had different goals. They're going to say, hey, they're not going to view a person as Japanese or Chinese. They're going to say, he's one of us, she's one of us. We should all have a peaceful world and live long and prosper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Now I'd like to call the member of the opposition to speak for 7 minutes.
Okay, I have a lot of material to cover in this debate, so I'm just going to get right into it. I think that the Star Trek Federation is a really bad example to use for this reason. We know absolutely nothing about how their government structure works. Yeah. We don't know how it is that they were able to go from like divisions between planets and states and whatnot to actually get this world peace. And they don't tell us on their side of the house how we're going to get that through this world government either. All they do is assert that peace is going to come into existence. Well, if we could will peace into existence, we would have done it like a few hundred years ago. I don't think that they can't make this assertion, and because so much of their arguments is contingent on this, you can't buy a lot of what they're saying on their side of the house. I'm going to get into my extensions. Adam and I want to talk about the importance of cultural diversity, what you actually lose when you get rid of the nation-state system. how that's detrimental to humanity, and finally, historical failures of this type of system that they're trying to set up. So let's first look to the point of the importance of cultural diversity. This is one of the reasons that we resist globalization and why globalization is not inevitable. Cultures develop as a means to define ourselves. We want to create traditions and to have differentiating factors between ourselves and other countries, and we don't really think on face why there's anything wrong with this. We think that we lose future contributions to culture when we have this one world government, and think about all the great things that we've had so far. Think about all the art, all the music, all the literature that wouldn't exist if people didn't have their own individual cultural traditions that we could stem from. And there's sort of a dialectic of cultures. Cultures don't exist when there's only like one people in the world. You have to have these differences in order to still get this cultural diversity note. Thank you. Think about how France was able to get jazz music because during Prohibition, all the people in America that wanted to still drink went to France and they brought cultural traditions with them. We think that it's a really great thing, but we don't think that you're going to continue to develop these sorts of traditions when you start to have one government. We also want to talk about the fact that distinctions exist within the EU, which they still list as a model, right? Like the EU accepts cultural differences and it embraces these, and they say that they want to get rid of them because they think that they cause conflict. And I have a problem with this whole EU example that they keep bringing up. This is a little bit of refutation here. They say that quality of life has improved for all EU members since the EU was established. Yeah, because they can exploit non-members, because they can set up trade barriers to other countries so that their member countries benefit more than these other countries. When you have one government and you no longer have these other countries to exploit, you lose that value. I mean, colonialism enriches countries that practice it too, but we don't say that that's a good practice and that we should advocate for that. And also, Tiffany's right, you can't will the resources to exist to make this work worldwide. You just can't. Now let's talk about why this is detrimental to humanity. We say that you have to choose one form of government here, right? Eventually you're going to have to decide if you're going to model this on a democracy, if you're going to have some kind of theology or oligarchy. And people are extremely passionate about their forms of government. Even within one form of government, you have a lot of differences. Adam gave you the great example during a POI of Great Britain. Most Americans would find an imposition of a British form of government in our country completely unpalatable because we have fundamental differences even between our two democracies. We think that you're just going to get a lot of war and a lot of really bad harms as you try to get to this step. You can't just will all these benefits into existence, and they never give you any analysis about that. We've seen wars fought over this. We've seen internal revolutions within countries fought over this. We're going to see lots of fighting about what type of legal code this one world government should have. We think that these are differences that it's okay for us to have. Saying that we should only have one world government is like saying there should only be one correct way of thinking. The only correct way of thinking is if you think that democracy is good and that's the best sort of government. Or if you think that Sharia law is good and that's the best legal code. And we think that it's really bad to say on our side of the house. We want to talk about the value of competition. This is the second point under the detriments to humanity. I'll get to you in 1 minute. We think that states better themselves by seeing what their neighbors do. We have growth through competition. It's a basic economic principle. It works in a lot of other areas of life too. Think about things like the space race. The reason that we're in space today and that the technology is so developed is because we wanted to compete with other nations to make sure we got there first. Human rights indices, right? We can track what other nations are doing. We know that other countries have human rights practices that are better than ours. So we know that there can be something different and that we have a standard that we can work to achieve. If we just have one standard worldwide, then we don't know that there's other things out there that we could be accomplishing. We need competition to show us that. I'll take your point.
So, if the status quo has all this war and hardship and stuff, then why wouldn't you move towards an alternative that
I get your point, but you never tell us why we're not going to have civil war. Why we're not going to still have revolution when you impose a certain type of democracy or a certain type of government on the whole world and not everybody likes it. You don't account for that. There's still going to be violence. We have ethnic cleansing even within the nation-state system. I don't think you're going to get rid of that under your system either. No thanks. We think that it's important. We also want to talk about historical value of this type of plan. Look at the USSR. Look at the Ottoman Empire. These are instances where people tried to have unified supranational governments like you're advocating for, and it didn't work because people didn't feel any sort of common identification with each other. They didn't want to have all the same role. They had different beliefs, and they weren't okay with having one government tell them this is how you should be as a people when they wanted to have diversity. I'll take you.
All right. So you say that during the USSR there was civil war, but since that foundation of the nation states, haven't we seen brutal ethnic cleansing in the form of Bosnia and Kosovo and Serbia?
But again, like, just getting rid of borders is not going to get rid of the tensions between those groups. It's not going to get rid of the beliefs that different people have, the different ideologies about what sort of rights we should have. You're not going to get rid of that. Look at like Egypt and Syria and the United Arab Republic. It broke off because even though they had like ethnic similarities, they had a lot of other differences. The UN has been around for 50 years. It's still having problems. The EU can't agree on its constitution, even though it's been in existence for 8 years. Like, there's a lot of inefficiencies with these governments, a lot of waste. That's really problematic. And one thing that I want to point out about their case is they keep talking about in second government this need for cohesion. Well, Mr. Speaker, they never tell you why we can't have common goals such as eradicating poverty, creating world peace, ending hunger, without like dissolving the nation state. Why do we have to get rid of the nation state in order to accomplish these goals? Like, I think that we've seen a lot of great progress in the area so far. Even though we have ethnic differences in different cultures, we've all come together to do things like find cures for different like epidemics. We've done that, even though we have differences. We've made progress as humanity, and I think we can continue to do this. They don't talk to you about, like, they don't try to will peace into existence on their side of the house, which is the main benefit, peace. But they don't tell you how they get there. They just sort of assert that it will happen. And because they assert that, all of their logic falls, all of their argumentation falls. They don't get any of the benefits, and they don't explain why they can't get these benefits under our current system. And we're really proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call to the floor the government whip to conclude the debate. The government side.
I'd like to first go over some of the arguments brought up by the opposition's case, and then I'd like to move on to crystallize the government's stance on this issue and bring through some of the very important issues that Ben addressed. Now, to begin with, the previous speaker talks about this whole passion for your own form of government. Now, I don't know why this hasn't been addressed up till now, but I will stand before you right now and tell you what the very best form of government is. And that is the form of government that listens to its people, that takes their views, that gives them some method of showing their views, makes compromises based on those views, and is directly providing for those people their human rights and their own beliefs. Now, what we have here is we are looking at retiring the nation-state system. We are looking at retiring the nation-state system. This is going to lead to listening to the voice of all peoples. Currently, there are many different regimes, many different authoritarian regimes. No, thank you. And what they do is they thrive on the exploitation of their people. They thrive through silencing their people through coercive means that should not be used. Well, no, thank you. Now, what we have and what we are going to have under the government stance is instead allowing these countries that are currently in the world to not just completely disband. Now, if we want to look at these countries, we can still allow them to collectively elect representatives, to collectively be heard, and then have that come together in a global conference to be able to make sure that when the rights of people in a certain area, because some warlord, because some person who just thinks that they can dictate what everybody in that country should believe and will do, when they try and do something like that, we will have an entire world unified telling them, no, what we need to do is we need to listen to the people of this world. We need to listen to all people of this world, and we need to make sure that we are not leaving out the people of Sudan, because they're not in the United States, the people of Chad, because they're not part of the United Kingdom. We need to look at all people equally and realize that a human life here in the United States is just as important as a human life anywhere else in the world. Yes.
If by definition a nation state is made up of an ethnicity exercising self-determination, why would a group of people collectively decide to oppress themselves? That doesn't make sense.
Okay, first of all, what we have is not necessarily within that country itself, but when you have a very homogeneously ethnic group next to another ethnic group, and you have two states that are already opposing on a governmental level, then it just adds to the ethnic conflict between two states, giving them more fuel for their fire as it's two nations together, and taking away, as I spoke about, that check of the global community, telling them, no, this is not right. We currently have problems in Darfur because people are not willing, countries are not willing to stand up, say it's wrong, and then do something about it. But if we're together as a world, if we're together as a human race, those problems no longer exist. People will take care of each other. Yes.
You just said that, like, as part of this body, we should have countries elect representatives and send it to this body so they can stop global problems. Isn't that essentially the UN, which exists in the status quo with nation states?
Now, what we're talking about here is, well, first of all, the UN is not made up of every country in the world. Now, what we're talking about is extending a UN, something similar to the UN, to encompass the entire world. Because just because you're a person in a country that's not part of the UN does not mean that you should not receive the same human rights that the people inside the UN are supposedly protected by the UN. So instead of leaving these people out, what we're doing is we're giving more support because we're doing this on a global level, which will lead to more support for these human rights in other countries. Yes?
If they're not part of the UN currently, how do you know that they actually want to be a part or that they can follow policies? I mean, what makes you think that this would be more successful than the UN?
Now, in my next point, I'll just go ahead and move right into it. Now, when considering the topic, it asks if we should retire nation states. Now, the only arguments on the opposition towards this and towards the inability of us to form this is it hasn't been done before. It's not going to work. However, what we look at here is not whether or not it's been done before, because you have questions on either side. However, what you were doing by voting with the government, by enacting this policy and saying that we believe nation states should be retired, we were saying that we should come together as a world, that we should break down these ethnic conflicts in our world, and we should give more power to a global organization that is willing and able to make sure that these atrocities that currently happen are not going to happen. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at what Ben brought up, which is this idea of cultural identity. Now this has been muddled throughout the debate. Many people believe that if we all come together, all of a sudden we're going to lose cultural identity. However, I am Hispanic, I have a Hispanic culture, and Ben kind of obviously does not. However, we're still under the United States, and as such, it makes it much easier for me to go up to Ben and have certain things in common with him that lead to my understanding of his culture and his understanding of my culture. We do not completely lose our culture. Instead, we have a more free-flowing knowledge of not only culture, but technology, ways to eliminate poverty, methods and innovations that can stop the atrocities that are occurring now.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to call to the floor the opposition whip to conclude the debate for the opposition and to conclude this final round.
I'm going to quickly go through these sort of new points, new information, new analysis, I don't know what you would call it, that just was brought forward by the last government speaker. Do a little bit of an overview of what both sides have brought to this, and then sort of coalesce down what it is that OPT stands for. Now, what did we hear from the government whip? Well, we heard that people have a passion for their own, passion for their own government, and they should, and really, all government should listen to their people and act in the best interests of their people. That's wonderful. But how do you do that when you look at the differences between one government, which acts in the best interest of its people, versus another government, which definitely acts in the best interest of its people? Is one better than the other? Is one worse than the other? How do you pass judgment on that? Isn't it more appropriate to take a pluralist approach when you say that perhaps they're both really good, and maybe I shouldn't make a judgment that they're worse than me, or I'm worse than them? Maybe I can just say that I can go be a tourist, in Western Europe, and say that they do things a little bit differently, but it works for them, and I go home and it works well for me. Why can't I be a good tourist? Anyway, so there's a subjective standard here. He talks about authoritarian regimes and how they can be stopped essentially by the UN. Well, they can be stopped essentially by the UN. He talked about there are member states that aren't a member of the UN. I feel kind of bad for Taiwan. They're sort of in a special situation. I feel really bad for the Vatican, but I think the 350 people living in Vatican City are hurt other ways as well. That's essentially the two really big states that aren't in the UN. It's 190 countries some odd. The states that aren't in there probably shouldn't be in there because they're pariah nations that we don't really want to hear from too often anyway, and they don't really have too much constructive to add to the discussion. No, thank you. Then they talk about how the only thing Opp is saying is that we shouldn't do this because it hasn't been done before. That is one issue that it hasn't been done before, and perhaps we should take a little bit of impression from history. But he completely ignores all the analysis brought forward by first Opp, and then the extension brought forward by second Opp in terms of why there are huge costs to doing this, on top of just it hasn't been done before. Ignores that at this point. And then he talks about cultural identity, of being a Hispanic American and a white American. And that's incredible. And it's a testament to America, and what de Tocqueville would call the melting pot. But the fact is that a Hispanic American is right there different than Hispanic living in a Hispanic country, just as much as a European American is different than a European living in Europe. By coming to the United States, just one moment, and entering into this melting pot approach, we change ourselves. We enter this immigrant culture that embraces everything equally, this polyglot sort of transformation. Why should we say that every other nation on the planet should also do this? You disagree.
If his example is proof that ethnic differences can exist within the US, still have culture, and still work, then why can't this system be expanded to other regions?
Okay, so perhaps it works in the US, except for the fact that we have the pay gap, except for the fact that we have huge racial and ethnic differences in the US that we're still working on, except for the fact that it took 200 years of civil war, slavery, and incredible economic disparity for us to get to this. Are we really going to ask Europe, Africa, and Asia to all go through the next 200 years to get to the point where the US still isn't even that perfect, still isn't even that great? It's a wonderful country, but we have huge issues that we should be dealing with. So, running down his sort of new analysis there, what is it the government side has brought forward, and what is it the opposition overall has brought forward? Well, government side has brought forward this sameness. They would call it unity. I would call it sort of vanilla. They brought forward a system in which you have instability because you have governments that aren't representative of their people. Perhaps that's elected in proportion to their people, but the interest of small people in Europe are not necessarily going to be heard in the entire EU. One small people in Asia or Africa aren't going to be heard by the entire African Union sort of multinational government. And we're going to say that those people are being forced into it against their will. Why should they be subsumed into this? And then he talked about how this is an incredible principle. We would say that it sounds really great, but it's incredibly impractical, pardon. You disagree?
So do you believe that cultural and ethnic division should make these uncrossable lines between peoples?
No, I think we should definitely cross these lines. We should definitely work to take down these barriers. But just to say that the fact that you feel different than me is wrong, the fact that my cultural identity, which is internalized into me and is part of my identity, is immoral or should somehow be completely destroyed just so that you can continue to exist is incredibly mean and is incredibly reproachful. And a more appropriate way would be to say that we're going to live in a pluralist society where there'll be one government there and there'll be one government here. And we'll have sovereignty and the ability for me to choose my government and my government to reflect me and for you to choose your government. And hopefully our governments won't fight, and in the vast majority of the time they won't. But if they do fight, it'll be on the common ground, battleground of ideas and not necessarily on the battleground of war. And what does opposition give you? Well, we give you a field of wildflowers, where one nation is different than the other, where where you can have this sort of biodiversity of ideas, biodiversity of analysis, biodiversity of government forms, of legal codes, of electoral systems, in which each one, as the government states is a great idea, of each one acting in the best interest of its people and in the best interest of human rights, but each in its own different form, each in its own different flower shape and petal design and stalk length. A great idea would be that I can see that the country over there has an analogous different, in terms of this analogy, has a different stalk length. Perhaps they have a different electoral cycle with a longer term in its Senate and a shorter term in its House. And they have a more efficient sort of social security system. Well, perhaps it's because they have a longer system. Perhaps we can then move forward. So this, in terms of this, so this is what Alpha brought forward. So what do Kate and I stand for? We stand on heritage, competition, and the world as a whole in that view. What do we get in terms of our heritage? We get a cultural system that embraces the fact that the Scotsman is different than the British. The fact that they embrace that it's a different identity altogether. The fact that they have passion for that. A Canadian cries when they sing "Oh Canada," not because there's onions in the room, but because they feel such incredible passion for what's embodied in that song, and the nationalism that's there. In terms of, and then you have the idea of mixing of cultures, which is incredible, and you get this sort of diffusion that comes out of it, such as jazz in Paris during the Prohibition, because an illegal system was enacted in the United States. Everyone fled the United States and went to Paris, and you got jazz out of it. That was an incredible thing that wouldn't have happened if there was one sort of uniform legal code or standard that was across many different nations. What do you get in terms of competition? Well, you have companies that are sort of stand-ins for their nations, such as like Boeing for us, and then EADS for the Europeans, which is incredible. They operate in the international battleground of business. You get governments that are all competing to be the most efficient, such as Norway competing with Sweden to be the most evolved in terms of government forms. They're already really high up there in terms of the UN Human Development Index. Why? But they're still pushing themselves because they have this other person right next to them, really similar to them, but also incredibly different with a different government form that they're constantly testing themselves against, testing the mettle of how their government is designed. And what do we get as the world as a whole? We get small is beautiful, smaller conflicts that are less likely because governments reflect their people. Thank you.
This concludes the debate. Please cross the aisle, shake hands, congratulate each other, and let's congratulate the debaters on giving us a great final round. And now, judges will begin deliberation, so please clear the house.
Why? What are you gonna do? No, I want to take your course. You can't cheat. What, you think you're special or something?
You want to go out to the store?
Sure. All of the audience members.
Please leave the house. This is your final warning. To open fire. And enjoy it. Hey, we're just bothering your decision.
Yeah. Okay. It'll be a few minutes. So, maybe we can all come up with a... Oh, it's not hard. These people are government. These people are government. Okay, so what we should, yes. So what we should do is come up with a ranking yourself. We have a ranking, and we should compare what we came up with. We might come up with. Oh, we'll give me a minute. Yeah. Maybe you could talk about that. Okay, cool. No, they're just learning. So let me come up with a ranking.
Obviously, we will have some history.
Let's see if I can interpret this. I think another way of phrasing how we should do this is you two should rank the first 14 and then I'll tell you if you're right. And if we're not right, we have to do the debate again. If we're not right, we have to do the debate all over again.
That's what I told one of my prelim rounds. I was like, I can't decide, so in 20 minutes we're going to do it again and show it. You're all right.
I don't want to do it again.
They're like, oh, what do you age? I'm like, no, just kidding. Awesome.
It's funny that it's right. That's right. impasse. None of the three judges are speaking.